I want to talk now about the idea of a good death, and certainly from a secular point of view, I think putting those two words together is an impossibility. So I think that you get a lot of blank looks from people if you said, "Is there such a thing as a good death?" I actually saw a celebrity being asked the Proust test recently, and he asked her that, and she just stared at him. I think she was a little offended, actually. So that's clearly part of that kind of death-denying society. It's almost in bad taste to ask somebody something like that. But certainly from within a religious framework, most of the world's traditions have, it may not be explicitly written anywhere, but ideas of what that would be, and clearly that those are related to their large beliefs about what a good life is and what the afterlife is, etc. And so I want in this lecture to look at the Jewish and the Christian concepts, and there's differences. They're related traditions, as you know, historically, but we can see there are significant differences in how they view a good death. And I think that for our society that's so multicultural, and if people are working in care, these things become very important because these are so vital to people. The idea they might not even consciously know what it is, but the idea that we should be sensitive to what this is for various cultures, I think is really important. I want to look first at the Jewish idea of death and what would be seen as the ideal death and what's involved in that. Now, there were Jewish communities throughout what I was talking about with Christendom in the Middle Ages, and increasingly large populations. Jews moved all throughout the Roman Empire. And then after the fall of the Roman Empire began, as part of the Jewish diaspora, they move into what is now Eastern Europe. Poland became a particular center for Jewish life prior to the Holocaust, and they moved into places like Spain, Portugal, England, France, and so on, Germany. Now, at various times they were expelled from countries like Spain and Portugal, and it's only been recently that there was apology given by those countries for that. So Jews always operated as a kind of embattled minority within what is now Europe. But nonetheless, they built societies with all of these different institutions because they operated quite separately a lot of the time, and they weren't able to own property, and they were often forced to live in separate areas like ghettos. And so we see in the ghettos and the shtetls, these farming communities, they start to develop their own social welfare system. And that continues even as they move into countries like Canada and the US. There are many different charitable organizations that are Jewish. So I want to look at some of their ideas of death. Now, in the discussion boards, a number of you brought up the idea that attitudes to death are related to what you think happens after death. And that's a very, very important point. And so in Judaism, there is no clear sense. There's certainly not one clear sense of the afterlife. Now that you may know, there are many denominations of Judaism, such as Orthodox, Conservative, Reform, Reconstructionist, etc., Hasidic. So they will vary, but generally, certainly the Jewish people I have known, they don't have a clear sense of it. We do have to be careful here because I did a reading project with a student last year, and the whole idea of tours of the afterlife was both Jewish and Christian. So it is there in some sense. And the Jews and the Christians often kind of shared these ideas of what happens after death. But just to be clear, the Jewish tradition tends to be much more focused on living an ethical life in the here and now, and not thinking too much about the afterlife. So one thing all the denominations of Judaism share is the belief that life is sacred, and so Christians and Jews share this, the idea that God created humankind, and so human beings partake of the sacred, and they're made in the image of God. So both traditions have that idea. So the idea of the sacrality of life. So it's been said that Jews have more idea of a proper death than a good death. And so that means that the death of a person should occur within the kind of scope of Jewish law or halakha. And so There may not be prescribed rituals, although there are a few that can be used, but the idea that they're living a good Jewish life, that's the main thing. And so it's that the death remains embedded within Jewish practice, and that includes what happens after. And so there are particular rituals around handling a dead body that many Jews practice. So as I said, a proper death is connected to Jewish law. And this, for instance, includes kosher. And so I'll just give the example of Montreal. A hospital was founded there, a Jewish hospital, to make sure that people who are undergoing care are able to, for instance, have kosher food while they're staying there. So the practices around death and the beliefs around death are based in Torah, Talmud, and rabbinic dialogues. So Judaism doesn't have a central authority the way Catholicism has the Vatican and the Pope. And so there, as I said, there's no one set way of doing it. It's more of a kind of a series of cultural norms. For those who have worked on this topic, unsurprisingly, they often turn to the Bible, or the Torah, to see what this looks like. And so we're told, for instance, that the original patriarch Abraham dies at a very old age, full of days, and he's gathered back to his people. That's a very common way it's described. So the person is old and is gathered back to their people. And so you can already see the outlines of what a good or proper death would look like. Ideally, you're old and you're seeing, for instance, your grandchildren. Another example is the patriarch Jacob. And so we're told that he gathers his sons around him and he sort of prophesies what's going to happen to them. And so this is often seen in the model in the sense of you're surrounded by your family. And also the idea of you're concerned about your legacy and what gets carried on within your family. And this is often likened to an early form of kind of directive for what you want done at the time of your death that we see in a more legal form in our culture. Another aspect of this, according to many of these people who write on this topic, is the idea of simple intimacy, that it isn't mandated that you have to do this and this and this, but that you're with your family or friends, it's an intimate, attentive relationship. And so you're being with that person who's dying. We definitely see in these stories an emphasis on family and filial duty, so that the family has certain duties to bury the person and to take care of them on their deathbed and so on. As I said, the idea of legacy. Also, the idea of not hastening death. So this is generally here in the religious understanding that it's God's will that decides when somebody dies. So we're not supposed to hasten death, but also not prolong suffering. And so this in the modern era, this comes out in terms of, do you continue feeding through a feeding tube and things like that. And so so this is always a balance, and we're going to look at this more when we talk about hospice in the contemporary era. But what is that balance between not hastening death but not prolonging it unnaturally? So as I mentioned, by the 13th century, by the Middle Ages, there were large Jewish communities throughout Europe, particularly Eastern Europe. And so communities had developed these social safety nets. And part of this was what's called a hekdesh, which is the equivalent of a Jewish hospice. And many of the writers make it clear that Jewish people would have been uncomfortable, perhaps, dying within more Christian-based hospices, partly because there was a long history of Christians trying to convert them. And so the hekdesh becomes their version of the hospice, or a Jewish hospice. And so it was often on the edge of Jewish settlements and was dedicated to care of the dying. And so we have an example from one of the stories of Isaac Bashevis Singer called Gimple the Fool, who wrote this kind of folkloric stories about that Eastern European community. And so I'll just read a little bit of it. At the door of the hovel, so the word hovel in English was actually hekdesh, so it's one of these Jewish hospices. Where I lie, there stands the plank on which the dead are taken away. The gravedigger Jew has his spade ready. The grave waits and the worms are hungry. The shrouds are prepared. I carry them in my beggar's sack. Another schnorrer is I love you. Another schnorrer is waiting to inherit my bed of straw. When the time comes, I will go joyfully. Whatever may be there, it will be real, without complications, without ridicule, without deception. So I think that's very evocative in terms of this clearly a very poor person and what their death would have been like in the Middle Ages. Christianity, certainly Roman Catholic Christianity, has had pretty clear ideas about a good death, and obviously they're related to religion. Again, as I said, we see that emphasis on the sacrality of each human life, and we're going to see that this deeply influences how hospice develops. So the idea of each individual, regardless of their social status or anything else about them, is sacred and has to be taken care of. No one template for good death. So that idea again of that individualism that's there. And I've often heard people say, if you go, you'll see there's many books called that have good death in the title. So there's many people thinking about this and writing about it. But the idea is there's no one template. That it's often been said that you die as you live. And so each death will be a little bit different. And then in Christianity, unlike Judaism, there is a very clear belief in the afterlife. And as we talked about on the discussion boards, that has a direct, mostly has, I'm not saying it takes away the fear of death completely, but it definitely mitigates it a bit. So we have the Christian idea of the afterlife, generally heaven, hell, sometimes purgatory in the Catholic tradition. And so the idea of living a moral life so that you then go on to a positive afterlife. The understanding that Jesus also suffered. So this is different than Judaism, and it's sometimes been written that the Jews will be saying, we don't want the suffering, right? So the idea that suffering has meaning within the Christian tradition is very important, and also the physicality of Jesus, that he also suffered. So it's written in the article that I'm making part of this section of the course. A good Christian death is not necessarily a physically painless one. I want to be careful here. I'm not saying that you would purposefully allow somebody to continue to be experiencing pain. Certainly hospice is all about working with pain and making sure people can die as painlessly as possible, but definitely the idea that, I think this is related to the larger concept that no one gets out of life without some pain, whether it's physical, emotional, spiritual. So that has to be taken into consideration. So within Christianity, many denominations have specific prayers and rituals at the time of death, so such as the last rites. So it's much more kind of prescribed. Often it involves clergy if there's time, that is a priest or pastor or minister will be brought to the deathbed, and often at hospices these are available for people. So the Christian ideal then of a good death is having lived a Christian life, and so then you're able to feel secure that you're going to have a good afterlife. I wanted to end here with some examples, and so I'm taking the first one from Tradition and Change in Jewish Ideals Regarding a Good Death by Norman Ravin, and he particularly focuses on this idea of the death of the patriarch. And so you can see in this image that the person is surrounded by their family. The woman is attending to probably her father or her grandfather, and the whole family is there. And so I do think this image expresses a desire on the part of many people to, obviously, not to be alone in death, but also to have their loved ones around them. So at the end of the chapter, Ravin includes, I thought this was very touching, a document that, an ethical will, which was written by his paternal great-grandfather, Yale Shapiro, and who's spent a lot of his life in Calgary. So he says this was written in Yiddish in 1956 before his death in 1957. And so it reads, "My dearest children, dear son-in-laws, dear daughter-in-laws, wonderful grandchildren and great-grandchildren, I hope your life is filled with good health and much happiness. My dearest, I am writing to you as a memory for later. No one lives forever. I want to tell you about my life in my later years, the good things and the bad things. The good things are that I'm 93 years old and still enjoy good health and a clear mind. All my children and their families are here from Russia, feeling fine, making a good living, and having wonderful children. Also, my dear youngest daughter Vera and her family moved to Calgary and is with us all and are happy and making a fine living. This, thank God, is all good. Okay, so you can see in this letter, clearly he's speaking to, you know, the generations that are coming after him. He's concerned with his legacy. And I think, as I said, I think it's very touching. He's concerned with the well-being of all of them. So whether they're his children or his grandchildren, and that they're all making a good living, they're also financially okay. So I think this speaks to, for many of us, the idea of a good death, that we want to know that the people around us that we care about are okay. That's a big part of having a good death that I actually don't think gets discussed that often. And when we talk about hospice, we're going to be talking about this, of that can be one of the ways of reassuring people as they're dying, that they know that those people are taken care of, for instance. So those are the good things. So he's clearly looking back on his life, and he's looking at his life. So the not so good is that I'm alone without my dear partner, your mother Leah, for 21 years, and this is a very great loss. Also that my two wonderful daughters, Rivka and Ethel, have gone at such an early age. But you can't question God. His judgment is always right, and you have to accept it. Okay, so he's obviously grieving the loss of his wife and his two daughters who went before him. But as a religious Jewish person, he's saying, I accept that this is the will of God. And so we often talk about in religious studies the way that belief in a higher power in this way really eases, not just in death, but in life as well, that you don't have control over these things. Dearest children, I want to thank you all for helping to make my life more comfortable and making it possible for me to go to shul every day and do my volunteer work for the deceased Israel and our shul. For all this, I bless you and thank you and wish you much nushas for your children. I want to thank so much my good son Joe and Roska for trying his best to make my life easier by collecting from all my children and giving me a check every month enough to live on. I also want to thank my good daughter Sorka for helping me to make my old years more comfortable. So we see very clearly here the idea of, you know, what in the Chinese tradition they would call filial piety, so that the children are also attending to this person as they're aging and then ultimately as they're dying. My dearest children, I'm asking all of you that before mine and your mother's Yahrzeit, you should all give to Joe $5 to send to Rabbi Gure in New York and for the yeshiva in Lod Israel. So he's directing them how to be good Jews into the future. And so he's expecting them to maintain these obligations of charity and to maintain their religious faith. My dearest children, I wish that you all will live as always in peace and harmony as a close family. Give to charity as much as you can, as all this helps to be a better person. Be good Jews and a good mensch, so a good person. I kiss you all and bless you all, your father, grandfather, and your great-grandfather, Yael Shapiro. So I think this is really quite amazing that the writer has shared this in an academic text. And I think it speaks a lot to what would allow somebody to have a good death within the Jewish tradition. I think it would be recognizable to people from almost any tradition, this idea that your progeny are happy and healthy, but also that they're going to maintain a way of life, a religious way of life that you passed on to them, and that they will be good people. And so I think this, in a sense, allows that person then to die in peace. I'm going to discuss now the example from your reading, A Good Christian Death at Home, Case Study 2. I'm not going to read all of it, but I do want to just highlight some aspects of it here. And so the image that I'm showing here is of a Christian deathbed. And so it looks very similar. The only difference would be that there's clergy there giving the last rites, so that ritual of the last rites. But you can see that everybody's praying at the deathbed. So this would be a very common Christian practice. So in this case, we're looking, the writer talks about the case of somebody who was a monk and how he had a good Christian death. So he was being taken care of people within the monastery, but also his relatives were called and came to his deathbed. And so that was one version of Christian death. Another being of a woman. So Effie was a lifelong and devoted member of the Anglican Episcopal Church. She never married, a boyfriend died in the war, and had a varied career driving ambulances during the war, as a social work afterward, she knew Cicely Saunders at the time, and then as personal assistant to a bishop. As the only unmarried one of 5 brothers and sisters, it fell to Effie to help her mother nurse her father in his last years, and then to look after her mother during the same process. In retirement, she consecutively lived or had living with her both of her sisters whom she cared for during their last years. So we see the way that care of the elderly and the dying often, and this is still true, often takes place within the family system. And when we start looking at how palliative care rolls out, this is often the preference of people, if possible, that they die at home. And so part of palliative care is developing systems where people can go into the homes of people and assist the family in this care. So it goes on to say, having cared for others in their final years, Effie was insightful in thinking about her own. She kept active as long as she could, coursing the garden with a Zimmer frame when walking further afield became impossible. With the onset of macular degeneration, she began to memorize poetry so that she could have it in her head when she could no longer read. Regular attendance at a Friday communion service Eucharist, attended by a number of other elderly parishioners and followed by a simple lunch, was the mainstay of her formal worship. So we can see in this example, she's continuing to live a Christian life even as her mobility is being decreased. Effie became gradually weaker and more confined to her room. She was no longer able to get out to church, and the priest or his assistant came instead to our home, where he said a brief version of the Eucharistic service and gave her communion. Sometimes other family members would share in this. During the Lord's Prayer, those present held hands together. For her private devotion, she enjoyed having candles in her room and saying morning and evening prayer from her Anglican prayer book, circumstances permitting with one of the family. Family members going on travels would return with crosses, icons, or blessed stones, which she treasured as gifts, as she did photos of her extended family, living and dead. Okay, so this idea that her world is kind of becoming more, she's less mobile and she's less able to get around, and so gradually she's, and this is typical of people who live to be in old age, that their world becomes more and more home-based. So when Effie was 97, she found her was found one morning slumped on the floor in her duvet. She was seriously weakened and could not move or say more than a few words at the time. So the doctor's called, the parish priest is called, and does the practice of the last rites through the anointing of holy oil. In it is service of prayers, blessings, and anointing with blessed oil for the purpose of healing and strengthening, whether for recovery or passage into death. And so many of you will be familiar with this. So for instance, if you go to the oratory in Montreal, you can buy this blessed oil. It doesn't have to be used for the last rites. It can be used in home-based prayer, but it's definitely used during the last rites. And so it goes on to say, as was to happen, Effie lived a further 18 months without, however, recovering ability to move or to do anything for herself. The National Health Service, so that's the public health service in England, provided a proper hospital bed with self-inflating on-the-move mattress to keep bed sores at bay, and this was put by a big bright window looking onto the garden. So this is, she's having a home-based rather than a hospice-based end of life. Because we knew Effie's pattern of religious life, we were able to continue with what we knew she liked: candles, morning and evening prayer from her prayer book, regardless of the religious commitment or lack thereof of the reader. I find this amusing. So the idea that maybe her relative is actually not a practicing Christian, but because that's what she wants, he or she is willing to do that. The Lord's Prayer, holding hands. The team from her church came regularly with communion, and the congregation also mentioned her in their regular cycle of prayer. So many of you will be familiar with this practice. This is common in many religious traditions, the idea that prayers are said for the ill and for the dying during services. We reminded Effie of the passing of the seasons as she saw them from her window, and of the seasons of the liturgical year: Christmas, Lent, Easter, Pentecost, all of which were resonant for her. Effie spoke very little, but always with lucidity when she did speak. Okay, so, and that's very common to that gradual process of maybe where the person is not speaking. From former discussions, I knew that Effie had a strong conviction in the life after death, but we rarely spoke about this. It was rather assumed. She was confident that God was with her in life and would be with her in whatever manner that might be after her death. It seemed evident to all who knew her that Effie was very happy to be alive, but not at all afraid of dying. Having nursed so many people in their last months during her own active life, she was the least demanding of patients of her own in her own weakness. Effie died in her own bed at home in November 2009. In her last week, she experienced serious pain in being moved by the nurses, probably from her crumbling spine. Prior to that time, she was on no medication, but the doctor now believed that the level of pain Effie was experiencing was unacceptable and prescribed morphine. So I'll let you read the rest, but it says, assisted by remarkably helpful National Health Service, our general practitioners, the district nurses, and special care nurses, we were all able to share in this good death. So I thought that was an interesting description of a kind of contemporary death where the religious elements are all in place, but also we see that role of secular healthcare. And so that's going to be a kind of a model when we start looking at the contemporary hospice and palliative care movement.